Nobody warned the courthouse that a 3-year-old was about to break everyone's heart. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, and Cincinnati had already pulled on its gray coat for the season. The sky sat low and heavy over the city, pressing down on the rooftops like a lid on a pot. Leaves, brown and brittle, skittered across the steps of the Hamilton County Courthouse as a black county vehicle pulled up to the curb and stopped. A social worker named Corinne Briggs stepped out first, smoothed her jacket, and then opened the back door. Out came Lily. She was 3 years old, small even for her age, with dark brown eyes so large they seemed to take up half her face. She wore a yellow dress covered in tiny white daisies, the kind of dress that belonged at a backyard birthday party, not on the steps of a courthouse where adult problems lived. On her feet were white shoes with a single strap across the top, the left one already coming undone. In her arms she carried Bun Bun, a stuffed rabbit who had once been white but was now the color of old cream, his left ear chewed down to a soft, flat ribbon from years of being held during moments exactly like this one. Corinne reached for Lily's hand. Lily gave it not because she felt safe, but because she had learned that holding a grown-up's hand was simply what you did in places like this. It didn't mean she trusted anyone. It just meant she was willing to walk. They went through the heavy front doors together, into the hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of floor polish and recycled air. The courthouse lobby was busy the way it always was on Tuesday mornings, lawyers walking fast with files tucked under their arms, clerks pushing carts stacked with folders, security guards waving people through metal detectors with the bored efficiency of people who had done the same motion 10,000 times. Nobody paid much attention to the small girl in the yellow dress. Corinne signed them in at the front desk, clipped a visitor badge to her own jacket, and then guided Lily toward the elevator. They rode up to the second floor in silence. Lily watched the numbers above the door change without any expression on her face. When the doors opened, Corinne led her down a long corridor with beige walls and water-stained ceiling tiles, past closed doors with official notices taped to them, all the way to the end of the hall where a waiting room sat tucked into the corner of the building. It was not a welcoming room. It had 4 chairs upholstered in scratchy gray fabric, a low table with a plastic tray of paper cups, a water dispenser that made a gurgling sound every few minutes, and a single narrow window that looked out onto the side of another building. Somebody had tried to make it friendlier. There was a small basket of children's books on the table and a plastic bin of crayons beside it. A laminated poster on the wall showed cartoon animals smiling at each other above the words, "Every voice matters." Lily looked at the poster for a moment, then looked away. Corinne settled her into one of the chairs and pulled a juice box from her bag, apple, the kind with the little bendy straw, and set it on the table in front of her. Lily didn't touch it. Corinne sat down beside her and tried a gentle smile. "You okay, sweetheart?" Lily looked at the floor. This had been going on for 3 days now. 3 full days of silence that had started the morning after the night in question. The night that had brought Lily into the county's care. The night that had launched this urgent and deeply sensitive family court case. The night that several adults in this building very badly needed Lily to talk about. She wasn't talking. The first professional to try had been a pediatric social worker named Dr. Emily Voss, who specialized in trauma responses in children under 5. Dr. Voss had a gentle voice, a warm office full of soft toys, and 15 years of experience coaxing words out of frightened children. She had sat with Lily for 2 hours across 2 separate sessions and had got nothing. Not a word, not even a reaction. Lily had simply sat and held Bun Bun and stared at a point somewhere just past Dr. Voss's left shoulder, as if she were watching something only she could see. The second attempt had come from a forensic child interviewer named Marcus Webb, who had conducted over 800 interviews with child witnesses and was widely regarded as one of the best in the state of Ohio. He had rearranged his entire schedule to make time for Lily. He had spent 45 minutes in a specially designed, child-friendly interview room with soft lighting, a small table at her height, and toys carefully selected to encourage communication. He had used every technique in his considerable arsenal: open-ended prompts, visual aids, drawing exercises, gentle reflection. Lily had drawn a picture of Bun Bun, and then stopped and put the crayon down, and said nothing for the remaining 30 minutes until Karen came to get her. Marcus had stood in the hallway afterward with his hands in his pockets, staring at the floor. "She's not being defiant," he had told Karen quietly. "She's not scared of me. She's just gone somewhere I can't reach. Something locked the door from the inside and I don't have the key." Now it was Tuesday morning, and the case could not wait much longer. A judge was waiting for information that only this child possessed. An entire legal process had ground to a halt because a 3-year-old in a yellow daisy dress had decided, in the profound and absolute way that only very young children can decide things, that the world of adults had nothing left to offer her. Karen looked at Lily sitting in that oversized gray chair, legs dangling 6 inches above the floor, fingers curled around Bun Bun's worn body, eyes fixed on the linoleum as if it contained some answer the rest of the room did not. She pulled out her phone and sent a message to her supervisor. It was a short message. It said, "We need to try something different. Do you think we could get the dog?" 3 minutes later, her phone buzzed with a reply. "Already called. He's on his way." Karen looked up at Lily. The little girl still hadn't moved. The water dispenser gurgled. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, the October wind pressed cold fingers against the narrow window. And somewhere in this building, 4 paws were already moving quietly down the hallway toward that locked door, carrying, without knowing it, the only key that was ever going to work. Officer Dana Mercer had been running late that morning, which almost never happened. She was the kind of person who set 2 alarms, packed her bag the night before, and arrived everywhere exactly 7 minutes early. Not 5, not 10, but 7, because she had once read that 7 minutes was the precise amount of buffer time needed to handle the unexpected without breaking a sweat. She was organized, methodical, and quietly intense in the way that people who care deeply about their work often are. But that Tuesday morning, her truck had a flat tire in the driveway, and by the time she had changed it in the cold October air, knuckles scraped, jacket sleeves smeared with grease, she was running behind. She jogged into the courthouse through the side entrance at 7:49, badge already in hand, and immediately felt Rex pressing his nose into her palm the way he always did when she arrived. He had been waiting with the on-duty kennel officer in the small holding room near the building's service entrance, patient as a stone, as if he had known she would come, and had simply decided to use the waiting time wisely. "Sorry, buddy," she said, crouching down and pressing her forehead briefly against his. "Rough morning." Rex licked her cheek once and wagged his tail as if to say that none of that mattered, and could they please get to work. This was one of the things Dana Mercer loved most about Rex. He did not hold grudges. He did not carry yesterday into today. Every single morning was, for Rex, the first morning full of possibility, full of purpose, completely unburdened by whatever had gone wrong the day before. In the 2 years they had worked together, she had never once seen him bring a bad mood into a room. She had, however, watched him absorb the bad moods of others and somehow, mysteriously, leave them lighter. She stood up and reached for his blue vest, which hung on a hook beside the door. It was a simple thing, a fitted blue fabric vest with white reflective lettering on both sides that read Courthouse Comfort Dog. Beneath that, in smaller letters, "Please ask before petting." She had always found that second line quietly funny. In 2 years, she had never once seen anyone ask. They just reached for him, and Rex accepted every hand that came his way with the gracious patience of someone who understood that being touched was sometimes the only thing standing between a person and their breaking point. She smoothed the vest over his back and fastened the clips beneath his chest. Rex stood perfectly still during this, the way he always did, not rigidly, but with a kind of dignified cooperation, like a knight accepting his armor before heading into something important. Her radio crackled. It was her supervisor, Lieutenant Greg Ferris. Mercer, second floor waiting room. Social workers got a 3-year-old who hasn't spoken in 3 days. Case is stalled. Judge is waiting. They want Rex. Dana clipped Rex's leash to his vest ring and straightened up. Copy that, 2 minutes. She looked down at Rex. He was already looking up at her, ears slightly forward, eyes alert and ready. In the 2 years they had worked together, she had developed the ability to read him the way you read someone you know deeply, the angle of his ears, the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of his stillness. Right now he looked the way he always looked before a difficult case. Not tense, not hesitant, just focused. Like a musician standing in the wings before walking on stage, completely present in the moment about to arrive. Kid this time, she said quietly as if briefing him. 3 years old, not talking to anyone. I don't know what's happened to her, but whatever it is, it was enough to shut her down completely. She paused. So just be you, okay? Just be exactly you. Rex blinked slowly, wagged once and turned toward the door. They took the elevator to the 2nd floor. Dana had made this walk dozens of times down this same corridor with its beige walls and buzzing lights, past these same closed doors with their official notices, toward one waiting room or another where someone sat inside who was frightened or grieving or so far inside their own pain they couldn't see the door out. Each time, she felt something settle inside her as Rex walked beside her, some particular quality of calm that seemed to radiate outward from him like heat from a fire, warming everything in its vicinity. She had tried to explain this to people and mostly failed. The closest she had come was once telling her sister, "You know how some people just walk into a room and the room gets better. Rex is like that, except he's a dog and it works on absolutely everyone, including people who don't even like dogs." Her sister had laughed. Dana had been completely serious. At the end of the corridor, she stopped outside the waiting room door. Through the small rectangular window, she could see the room clearly, the gray chairs, the basket of books, the water dispenser, the cartoon animal poster on the wall. She could see Karen Briggs, the social worker, sitting very still in one of the chairs with her hands folded in her lap, looking at her phone but not really seeing it. And she could see Lily. The little girl sat in the chair farthest from the door, legs dangling, yellow dress bright as a sunflower against the gray fabric. She was holding a stuffed rabbit to her chest with both arms, and her head was bent forward so that her chin nearly rested on top of it. She was not moving. She was not looking at anything. She looked, Dana thought, like a candle that had been blown out, still shaped like a candle, still standing upright, but with no light left inside. Something tightened in Dana's chest. She had seen a lot of things in this job. She had walked Rex into rooms containing some of the most profound human pain she had ever witnessed. She had learned mostly to stay steady, to be the calm handler Rex needed, to keep her own emotions from bleeding into his work. But something about the sight of that small girl in the yellow dress, sitting so perfectly still in that cheerless room with her worn rabbit pressed to her heart, hit Dana somewhere deep and unguarded. She took one breath, then another. Rex was looking up at her, reading her the way she read him, noticing the pause, noticing the slight tension in her hand on his leash. He pressed his nose gently against her fingers. "I've got this," it seemed to say. "Let me go do what I do." Dana exhaled slowly and put her hand on the door handle. There was something she always did at this moment, a small private ritual she had never told anyone about. She would pause with her hand on the door and think, clearly and deliberately, whatever happens on the other side of this door, Rex will be exactly what this person needs. She had thought it before grief-stricken widows. She had thought it before angry teenagers. She had thought it before trembling elderly witnesses who reminded her of her own grandmother. She thought it now. Whatever is on the other side of this door, Rex will be exactly what she needs. Then she turned the handle and pushed the door open. Rex stepped in first. He moved the way he always moved in new spaces, unhurried, observant, with that particular quality of attention that made every person in a room feel, on some level below conscious thought, that he had come specifically for them. He took 3 steps inside, stopped, and read the room. His eyes found Lily immediately. And something happened that Dana had never seen before in 2 years of watching Rex work. He did not approach. He did not perform. He did not do any of the things that well-meaning humans do when they encounter a frightened child. He did not crouch down, did not make encouraging sounds, did not try to make himself smaller or friendlier or less threatening. He simply walked to the center of the room, lowered himself to the floor with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who has all the time in the world, rested his chin between his front paws, and went completely, utterly still. And then he waited. Because Rex understood, in whatever way dogs understand the things that matter most, that some doors cannot be knocked on. Some doors can only be approached quietly, patiently, without agenda, and then waited beside until the person on the other side decides, entirely on their own, that it might be safe to open them. So he waited. And the clock ticked. And the water dispenser gurgled. And across the room, in the oversized gray chair, a little girl in a yellow daisy dress slowly lifted her head. The room did not change when Lily lifted her head. The fluorescent light still hummed its single flat note above the ceiling tiles. The water dispenser still gurgled in the corner every few minutes like a polite interruption nobody asked for. The cartoon animals on the poster still smiled their laminated smiles at a room that had very little to smile about. Corinne Briggs still sat in her chair with her hands folded in her lap, barely breathing, afraid that even the smallest movement might shatter whatever fragile thing was beginning to form in the air between a golden dog and a 3-year-old girl. Nothing in the room changed. But everything in the room changed. Because Lily was looking up, and in 3 days of trying, 3 days of juice boxes and crayons and soft voices, and carefully chosen words and every professional technique that money and experience and genuine human compassion could devise, nobody had managed to make that happen. Not once. Not for a single sustained second. Rex had done it in 7. He hadn't moved from his spot in the center of the room. His chin still rested between his front paws. His tail was still. His breathing was slow and visible, his golden sides rising and falling with the unhurried rhythm of something that had never once in its life been in a hurry. He was simply there, present in the room the way a warm fire is present in a cold space, not demanding anything, not performing anything, just radiating a quality of calm so deep and so genuine that it seemed to reach across the gray linoleum and touch the small girl in the yellow dress like a hand on her shoulder. Lily stared at him. Her dark eyes moved over him slowly, taking in the golden fur, the blue vest, the broad, gentle head resting on the floor, the slow rise and fall of his breathing. Her fingers, which had been wound so tightly around Bun Bun's worn body that the knuckles had gone pale, slowly loosened. Not all at once, just slightly, just enough. In the hallway outside, the 2 attorneys who had been watching through the narrow observation window had gone completely silent. One of them, a sharp, skeptical defense attorney named Richard Holt, who had spent 20 years believing that courtrooms ran on logic and evidence and nothing else, had his arms crossed over his chest and his jaw tight. But his eyes were fixed on Lily, and something in his expression had shifted from skepticism into something he would have been deeply reluctant to name. The other attorney, a child welfare advocate named Patricia Soames, had one hand pressed flat against the glass as if she could reach through it. She had been in this work for 16 years. She had seen children come back from places that seemed unreachable, but she had never seen it happen like this. Not this fast, not this quietly, not with this particular quality of simplicity that made it feel less like a professional intervention and more like something ancient and instinctive clicking into place. Inside the room, Lily's feet shifted on the edge of the chair. Corinne Briggs saw it and held herself so still she forgot to blink. Lily looked at Rex for another long moment, studying him, weighing him, running him through whatever private calculation a 3-year-old runs when she is deciding whether the world has finally produced something worth trusting. Then she made her decision. She slid off the chair. Her white shoes touched the floor without a sound. She straightened up, Bun Bun held loosely in one arm now instead of clutched with both, and she looked at Rex across the open floor between them. 8 feet, maybe 10. Not far. But for a child who had spent 3 days building walls, it might as well have been a mile. She took the first step. Then the second. Then the third. Small steps, deliberate and careful, as if the floor might change its mind about holding her up if she moved too quickly. She crossed the room with the focused seriousness of someone completing a task she had decided on entirely by herself, and when she reached Rex, she did not hesitate. She sat down cross-legged directly in front of him, close enough that her knees nearly touched his front paws, and she looked at him at eye level for the first time. Rex lifted his head. His amber eyes met hers, and his tail, that slow, steady metronome tail, gave one single gentle wag. Not an excited wag, not a performative wag, just one quiet, easy movement that said, in the universal language that dogs have been speaking to humans for 10,000 years, "I see you. You're safe. I'm not going anywhere." Lily looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then she leaned forward and pressed her lips close to his ear and began to whisper. Officer Dana Mercer, standing near the doorway with Rex's leash slack in her hand, felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. Not from fear. From something else entirely, that particular sensation that arrives when you are witnessing something that you know, in the moment it is happening, that you will never forget for as long as you live. She did not move, she did not speak, she barely allowed herself to breathe. Corinne Briggs had tears in her eyes that she was working very hard to keep from falling. Because she was a professional and professionals did not cry in waiting rooms, except that sometimes they did, and this was almost certainly going to be one of those times. In the hallway, Patricia Soames had both hands on the glass now. Richard Holt had uncrossed his arms. His hands were in his pockets, and his head was slightly bowed. And if you had asked him in that moment what he was feeling, he would have cleared his throat and said something about needing to review the evidentiary implications. But the truth he would admit only to himself, much later, driving home in the dark, was that he was watching something that moved him in a place that legal training had never touched and never could. Lily's whispers were too soft to hear from across the room. Just the shape of words, the breath of them, the intimate murmur of a voice that had been locked away for 3 days, finally finding the one audience it was willing to trust. Rex held perfectly still. His ear was warm against her lips. His fur smelled like outside air and something clean and uncomplicated. He did not tilt his head. He did not shift his weight. He gave her no signal that said hurry up or speak louder or say it in a way I can use. He simply received her words the way deep water receives a stone, completely, quietly, without judgment, closing gently around whatever she gave him and holding it safe. The clock on the wall ticked. The water dispenser gurgled. The fluorescent light hummed its single flat note. And Lily kept whispering. 30 seconds passed, then a minute, then 2. The room existed outside of time now, suspended in the particular stillness that only arrives when something genuinely important is happening, and every person present is wise enough to recognize it and get out of its way. At some point during the second minute, Lily's free hand, the one not holding Bun Bun, moved slowly forward and came to rest on the side of Rex's neck. Her small fingers pressed into the warm golden fur and stayed there, as if she had found something solid in a world that had recently proven itself to be anything but. Rex's tail moved again, slow and steady, once, twice, 3 times. Dana Mercer would later struggle to describe this moment accurately to the people who asked her about it, the journalists, the courthouse administrators, the other facility dog handlers from around the country who called her in the months afterward wanting to understand what had happened in that room. She always tried to find the right words and always felt they fell slightly short. The closest she ever came was this. It looked like a reunion, not a first meeting, a reunion, like they had known each other before, somewhere in some place neither of them could name, and they had simply found each other again. She paused whenever she said this, aware of how it sounded. Then she always added, "I know that's not a scientific explanation, but I was there, and that's what it looked like." Inside the waiting room, Lily pulled back slightly from Rex's ear. She looked at him, really looked at him, the way children look at things they are trying to memorize. Then she leaned back in, her lips finding his ear again, and her whispers shifted into something slightly louder, still soft, still intimate, still meant only for Rex. But now, for the first time, the edges of her words were becoming audible. Corinne Briggs leaned forward, almost imperceptibly in her chair. Dana Mercer's fingers tightened slightly on the leash she no longer needed to hold. Through the observation window, two attorneys stood shoulder to shoulder in silence, watching a 3-year-old girl find her voice inside a gray waiting room on the second floor of a courthouse. Not because any adult had managed to reach her, but because a golden dog had walked into the room, laid himself down in the center of the floor, and simply waited for her to come to him. Nobody had written this into any protocol. Nobody had trained for this specific moment. Nobody had seen it coming. And yet here it was, unscripted, unrehearsed, and more real than anything that had happened in this building all week. A child and a dog, sitting together on a gray linoleum floor, speaking quietly to each other in the language of trust. The first word came through clearly a moment later. It was soft, it was small, it was the beginning of everything. The first word that came through clearly was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was not the kind of word that announces itself with weight and significance, the way words do in movies when the moment of breakthrough finally arrives, and the music swells, and everyone in the room exhales at once. It was just a small, soft word, the kind of word a 3-year-old uses when she is telling someone something real, something that lives in the part of her memory that is more feeling than language, more image than sentence. The word was scary. It was scary, Lily said, quietly, almost to herself, but clearly enough finally for the people in the room to hear. Corinne Briggs did not move. She had been sitting so still for so long that her back had begun to ache, but she would not have shifted in that chair for anything in the world. Not now. Not when Lily was finally speaking. Dana Mercer stood near the doorway with Rex's leash slack between her fingers and her eyes fixed on the back of Lily's small head. The dark hair pulled into 2 uneven pigtails that someone had clearly done in a hurry that morning, one slightly higher than the other. She watched Lily's shoulders, which had been drawn up tight toward her ears for 3 days, slowly begin to lower. Rex had not moved a single muscle. He lay with his chin resting on the floor between his paws, Lily seated cross-legged directly before him, her small hand pressed into the warm fur at the side of his neck. His amber eyes were half closed, not sleepy, but soft, receiving, the way eyes look when they are truly listening and not simply waiting for their turn to respond. His breathing was deep and slow and completely unhurried, and Lily's breathing, Dana noticed, had begun to match it. In, out, in, out. The breathing of 2 creatures who had, in the span of 10 quiet minutes, arrived at something that resembled peace. It was scary, Lily said again, as if testing the words a second time to make sure they still meant what she needed them to mean. Then she added, in the fragmented, vivid way that very young children describe the things they have seen, the loud voices, and the broken thing on the floor. Through the observation window in the hallway, Dr. Sandra Holloway pressed her hand over her mouth. She was a child psychologist with 21 years of experience, 2 decades of sitting across from frightened, wounded, confused children and finding ways to gently draw out what they carried inside. She had a reputation in Ohio's child welfare community for being unshakable. Colleagues described her as the person you wanted in the room when things were at their most difficult, because Sandra Holloway did not panic, did not freeze, and did not let her own emotional responses interfere with the work. Right now, her hand was over her mouth, and her eyes were bright with something she was not going to call tears, even though that is exactly what they were. Because Lily was talking, and what she was saying mattered enormously. Lily's hand moved deeper into Rex's fur, her fingers disappearing into the thick golden coat at his neck. She seemed to draw something from the contact, some current of steadiness that traveled from him into her through the simple, warm fact of touch. She took a breath that was slightly uneven, slightly shaky, and then she continued. She told Rex about the couch. She told him, in the halting and particular language of a 3-year-old, about crawling behind it, behind the big couch in the living room with the scratchy cushions, and pulling her knees up to her chest and making herself as small as she possibly could. She told him about holding Bun Bun so tightly that his stuffed body had gone flat against her chest. She told him about closing her eyes and counting, the way her babysitter had once taught her to count when thunderstorms came, because counting gave the scared feelings somewhere to go. She had counted to 11, she said, and then the loud noise happened. Dana Mercer felt her jaw tighten. She kept her face neutral through deliberate effort. Corinne Briggs had stopped pretending she wasn't crying. A single tear moved down her cheek and she let it go, because stopping it would have required moving, and she was absolutely not moving. Rex's tail moved once, slow and even, a metronome of safety. Lily looked at him for a moment, checking, the way children check the face of the person they are talking to, reading it for signs of whether it is still safe to continue. Rex's face gave her exactly what she needed. Nothing alarming, nothing urgent. Just those steady amber eyes and that slow, patient breathing and the solid warmth of his body beneath her hand. She kept going. She told him what she had seen when she finally opened her eyes and looked around the edge of the couch. She described it the way children describe things they have witnessed, but do not yet have the adult vocabulary to fully process, in colors and shapes and feelings rather than precise nouns and verbs. She said there was red on the floor near the kitchen. She said one of the chairs was tipped over sideways. She said the front door was open, and the cold air was coming in, and the curtains were moving, and she did not know where the people had gone. She said it had been very quiet after the loud noise. She said the quiet had been scarier than the loud. In the hallway, Richard Holt, the defense attorney who had spent 20 years believing that courtrooms ran entirely on logic, stood with his arms at his sides and his eyes fixed on the floor outside the observation window, listening to the muffled but audible voice of a 3-year-old describe what she had seen, and felt something move through him that he had no professional category for. Dr. Holloway was writing rapidly in her notebook, her handwriting smaller and faster than usual, capturing every word and detail she could hear through the slightly open door that Corinne had quietly cracked 2 inches when Lily began speaking. She wrote without looking up, filling lines with the clinical shorthand of someone trained to record and analyze, while simultaneously being, underneath all of that training, simply a human being listening to a small child describe the worst night of her short life. The details were specific, they were consistent, they were delivered without the coaching artifacts, the repeated phrases, the adult vocabulary, the narrative structure that trained interviewers looked for as signs that a child's account had been shaped by someone else. This was raw. This was unfiltered. This was exactly what 3 days of formal interviews had been unable to produce. This was the truth, arriving the only way it could, not through a protocol, not through a structured interview, not through any of the careful professional frameworks that adults build to extract what children know. It was arriving through a golden dog lying on a gray floor, breathing slowly, holding perfectly still, asking nothing. Lily paused. She looked at Rex again with those enormous dark eyes, and something in her expression shifted slightly, a small shadow crossing her face, the way a cloud crosses the sun for just a moment before passing. She pressed her lips together. Her fingers tightened briefly in his fur. Then she said the thing that made Dana Mercer's breath stop completely in her chest. "I didn't tell anybody," Lily said, very quietly, "because I thought if I told, the scary would come back." The room was absolutely silent. Rex lifted his head from his paws. He looked at Lily with a directness and a gentleness so perfectly combined that it seemed impossible for a single expression to contain both. And then he did something that none of the humans in the room had prompted or trained him to do in this specific moment. Something that existed entirely outside of any protocol or technique or professional framework. He leaned forward slowly and rested his broad, warm forehead very gently against Lily's. Just for a moment, just long enough. Lily closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the shadow in her expression was gone. In its place was something fragile but real, something that looked, cautiously and tentatively, like relief. Like the particular lightness that comes when a thing that has been carried alone for too long is finally set down. "But I told you," she said to Rex, softly, matter-of-factly, with the simple logic of a child who has worked something out. "And you didn't get scared, so maybe it's okay." Rex's tail moved in that slow, steady way. And Lily, for the first time in 3 days, almost smiled. Dr. Sandra Holloway stopped writing. She looked up from her notebook at the 2 inches of open door and the small girl visible through it, and she thought, with the clarity that sometimes arrives in moments of genuine significance, that she had just witnessed something she would spend the rest of her career trying to fully understand. A 3-year-old had been carrying an unbearable weight in complete silence, because she believed that speaking would bring the danger back. And a dog, a golden, patient, wordless dog, had somehow communicated to her without a single word that it was safe to put it down. No degree had taught that, no training manual had written it, no professional framework had anticipated it. It had simply happened, the way the most important things always happen, quietly, without announcement, in a room where the right presence showed up at exactly the right moment and asked nothing except to be there. The second floor of the Hamilton County Courthouse had a particular sound when something significant happened. It was not a loud sound. It was not the dramatic crash of a gavel or the sharp rise of voices in a crowded gallery. It was subtler than that, a shift in the quality of the air itself, a change in the rhythm of footsteps in hallways, a series of doors opening and closing in quick succession, the particular frequency of hushed and urgent conversation that spreads through a building the way water spreads through dry ground. Fast, invisible, unstoppable. By 11:15 that Tuesday morning, that sound was everywhere. It had started the moment Dr. Sandra Holloway closed her notebook, straightened up from her position outside the waiting room door, and walked quickly down the corridor toward the office of the presiding judge. She moved with the controlled urgency of someone carrying information that could not wait, not running, because running in courthouse hallways attracted attention, and attention was the last thing this situation needed right now, but walking at the absolute upper limit of what walking could reasonably be called. She knocked twice on Judge Patricia Warren's door and pushed it open without waiting for an answer. Judge Warren looked up from the brief she had been reviewing. She was a compact, precise woman in her late 50s with silver hair cut close to her head and reading glasses perched at the very end of her nose. She had a face that had been trained by decades on the bench into a state of permanent, careful neutrality, a face that gave nothing away until it was ready to give something. She looked at Sandra Holloway, standing in her doorway slightly out of breath, and something in her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Tell me," she said. Sandra told her. Judge Warren listened without interrupting, a skill she had spent 22 years perfecting and that she considered among the most important tools in her professional arsenal. She sat with her hands folded on the desk and her eyes steady on Sandra's face, absorbing every word, every detail, every implication. When Sandra finished, the judge was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Where is the child now?" "Still with Rex. Corinne is with her. She's calm. Sandra paused, searching for the right word. "She's different. Something shifted in there. I've never seen a disclosure happen quite like that." Judge Warren removed her glasses and set them on the desk. She looked at the window for a moment, the gray October sky pressing down on the city outside, and then she looked back at Sandra. "Get both legal teams into conference room B," she said. 30 minutes. Sandra nodded and pulled the door closed behind her. Judge Warren sat alone in her office for exactly 45 seconds. Then she put her glasses back on, picked up her brief, set it aside, and reached for her notepad instead. She began writing, not the formal, structured notes of a judge preparing a ruling, but the rapid, exploratory writing of a person thinking through something genuinely new, something that none of her 22 years had quite prepared her for. She wrote one question at the top of the page and underlined it twice. What does the law do when the truth arrives in a form it wasn't designed to receive? Conference Room B was a long, windowless room with a rectangular table that seated 12, walls the color of old mustard, and a whiteboard at one end that still had the ghost of last week's case notes visible beneath a hasty erasing. It smelled like stale coffee and the particular brand of tension that accumulated in rooms where difficult things were regularly decided. By the time both legal teams arrived, the tension in the room was already thick enough to lean against. On one side of the table sat the child welfare team, Patricia Soames, the lead child welfare attorney, flanked by 2 associates and a representative from the county's Child Protective Services Division. Patricia was 44, experienced, and quietly ferocious in the way that people become ferocious when they have spent 16 years fighting for children who cannot fight for themselves. She had a yellow legal pad in front of her and a pen in her hand, and the look of someone who had already begun constructing arguments in her head before she sat down. On the other side sat Richard Holt and his associate, a young attorney named Daniel Park, who was still new enough to the job that his face had not yet learned to hide what he was thinking. Right now what it was thinking was clearly visible. He was unsettled. Richard Holt, by contrast, had his professional mask firmly in place. His suit was immaculate. His expression was composed. But his fingers, Patricia noticed, were drumming a quiet, irregular rhythm on the table, which in her experience meant that Richard Holt was less certain than he was pretending to be. Dr. Sandra Holloway sat at the far end of the table with her notebook open. Officer Dana Mercer had been asked to attend as well and sat near the door, straight-backed and attentive, Rex lying quietly beside her chair. When Rex entered the room, Daniel Park had looked at him with an expression that mixed curiosity and something almost like recognition, as if he were seeing for the first time the actual physical reality of what everyone was about to spend the next hour arguing about. Judge Warren entered last. Everyone stood. She waved them back down with a single economical gesture and took her seat at the head of the table. "Let's begin," she said, "and I want everyone to understand before we start that I am not interested in theatrics this afternoon. I am interested in clarity. We have a situation that is legally novel and time-sensitive, and I intend to approach it as such." She looked around the table. "Ms. Soames, start." Patricia Soames clicked her pen. "Your Honor, what occurred this morning in the second-floor waiting room represents one of the most significant spontaneous disclosures in this case to date. The child provided specific, detailed, and internally consistent information that investigators have been unable to obtain through 3 days of formal interview attempts. The disclosure was unprompted, uncoached, and delivered in the natural, fragmented language characteristic of genuine child memory, rather than rehearsed or influenced testimony. We believe the substance of that disclosure is not only relevant but critical to these proceedings." Richard Holt did not wait to be invited. "Your Honor, with respect, What occurred this morning was a 3-year-old child speaking informally to an animal in a waiting room. There was no certified forensic interviewer present. There was no structured protocol followed. There was no recording made under evidentiary standards. The statements were not made under any of the conditions required by Ohio law for child witness testimony to be admissible. The defense submits that whatever was said in that room this morning cannot and should not be entered into these proceedings in any capacity. It was recorded, Sandra Holloway said quietly. The room went still. Richard Holt turned to look at her. I beg your pardon. The waiting room has a standard security camera, Sandra said. It records continuously, audio and video, the courthouse's own system. She paused. Everything Lily said this morning is on that recording. The silence that followed had a particular quality, the quality of people rapidly recalculating. Patricia Soames kept her face neutral, but her pen had stopped moving. Daniel Park's expression shifted through 3 different things in 2 seconds. Richard Holt looked at Judge Warren, who was looking at Sandra Holloway with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. That changes the conversation somewhat, Judge Warren said. It changes it considerably, Patricia said. Richard Holt set his pen down on the table with a small, precise click. Your Honor, even with a recording, the admissibility question remains. The setting, the circumstances, the absence of proper protocols. Mr. Holt. Judge Warren's voice was not loud, but it had the particular quality of a sound that fills a room completely, leaving no space for anything else. I am aware of the admissibility questions. I am aware of every argument you are about to make because I have been on this bench for 22 years and I have heard most of the arguments that exist. She paused. What I am asking everyone in this room to do right now is not argue. What I am asking is to think. To think carefully and seriously about what happened this morning, what it means, and what our obligation is to a 3-year-old child who found a way to tell the truth when every formal mechanism we had available to us had failed. The room was quiet. Judge Warren looked around the table one more time, at Patricia Soames with her yellow legal pad, at Richard Holt with his composed and careful face, at Sandra Holloway with her notebook full of words that a small girl had whispered to a dog, at Dana Mercer sitting near the door with Rex stretched out quietly beside her chair. Her eyes rested on Rex for a moment. Then she said, I'll have a ruling by morning. She gathered her notepad, stood, and walked out of the room. For a long moment after the door closed behind her, nobody at that table said a single word. The ghost of last week's case notes watched from the whiteboard. The fluorescent light hummed above them all. And under Dana Mercer's chair, Rex exhaled slowly and rested his chin on his front paws. He had, as far as anyone could tell, found the whole thing entirely unremarkable. Judge Patricia Warren did not sleep well that night. This was not unusual for her. In 22 years on the family court bench, she had lost more nights of sleep than she could count, lying awake in the dark with cases running through her mind like water through a channel, turning decisions over and over, looking at them from every angle, testing them against the law and against something older and quieter than the law that she had never found a precise name for. Call it conscience. Call it the accumulated weight of 2 decades spent deciding things that mattered enormously to people who had no one else to decide for them. But this night was different. She had reviewed the security camera footage 3 times. Sitting alone in her home office at her desk with a cup of tea that went cold beside her laptop, she had watched the same 11 minutes of grainy courthouse video 3 times from beginning to end. She had watched Rex walk into the room and lower himself to the floor. She had watched Lily look up. She had watched the small girl slide off the chair and cross the room in those careful, deliberate steps and sit down in front of the dog and begin to whisper. And she had watched Lily's face change. That was the thing that stayed with her through the long hours of the night. Not the legal questions, those she could navigate. She had tools for those. She had precedent and statute and 22 years of judicial reasoning to bring to bear on those. What she could not stop seeing was the expression on Lily's face as she sat on that gray linoleum floor with her hand pressed into Rex's golden fur. It was the face of a child putting down something heavy. Judge Warren had seen a great many things in family court. She had seen parents at their worst and children at their most vulnerable. She had made rulings that had changed the entire trajectory of young lives, and she had carried the responsibility of those rulings with the seriousness they deserved. She was not a sentimental person by nature. Sentimentality and judicial precision did not coexist comfortably, and she had long ago learned to keep her emotional responses in a separate room from her professional ones. But at 2:17 in the morning, watching for the third time as a 3-year-old girl leaned her forehead against a golden dog's forehead and closed her eyes with an expression of profound and exhausted relief, Judge Patricia Warren felt something move through her that she could not put in a footnote or cite in a ruling. She closed her laptop. She sat in the dark for a while. Then she opened it again and began to write. The courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Hamilton County Courthouse held approximately 60 people in its gallery when full. On Wednesday morning it held 53, which for a family court proceeding, typically attended only by directly involved parties and their counsel, was remarkable. Word had traveled, the way it always traveled in courthouse buildings, through the particular grapevine of clerks and bailiffs and junior attorneys who heard things in corridors and passed them along in elevator rides and parking garage conversations. Something was happening in Warren's courtroom, something nobody had seen before. By 7:45, every seat in the gallery was filled. People sat with the particular stillness of an audience that knows it is about to witness something significant and does not want to miss a word of it. The 2 legal teams were arranged at their respective tables, Patricia Soames and her associates on the left, Richard Holt and Daniel Park on the right. Both teams had thick folders open in front of them, both had pens ready, and both wore the carefully composed expressions of people who had spent the night preparing for every possible outcome and were still not entirely certain they had prepared enough. Dana Mercer sat in a chair along the side wall with Rex beside her. Rex had drawn every eye in the room the moment he entered, a ripple of recognition moving through the gallery, people leaning toward each other and whispering. He accepted the attention the way he accepted everything, without any particular reaction, his amber eyes moving around the room with calm curiosity before settling into stillness. At exactly 8 o'clock, the bailiff called the room to order. Judge Warren entered. She moved to her seat with the unhurried precision that was her signature, not slow, but deliberate, as if every step were a considered choice. She set her papers on the bench, adjusted her glasses, and looked out at the room for a moment before sitting. Her gaze moved across the gallery, across the legal teams, paused briefly on Rex, and then settled on the middle distance with the expression of someone who has arrived at a decision and made peace with it. The room sat. She opened her notes and began. This court has spent the past 18 hours considering a question that has no clean precedent in Ohio family court jurisprudence, she said. Her voice was measured and clear, the voice of someone who had spent decades making certain that every person in a room could hear and understand exactly what she was saying. The question is this: what legal weight, if any, attaches to statements made spontaneously by a child witness in an informal setting, in the presence of a certified courthouse facility animal, captured on the court's own security recording system? The room was so quiet that the heating system's low hum was audible. I want to address the admissibility question directly and without ambiguity, Judge Warren continued. The statements made by the minor child in the second-floor waiting room yesterday morning do not meet the evidentiary standards required for direct admission as testimony under Ohio law. The session was not conducted by a certified forensic interviewer. The proper protocols were not followed. The safeguards that exist to protect both the integrity of child testimony and the rights of all parties in these proceedings were not in place. She paused. On that question, the defense is correct. Richard Holt's shoulders moved a fraction of an inch, the closest thing to visible relief that his professional composure would permit. However, Judge Warren said, the word landed in the room like a stone in still water, and every person present felt the ripple. However, she repeated, this court is not prepared to treat what occurred yesterday morning as legally meaningless simply because it arrived through an unconventional channel. The statements captured on the courthouse security recording are specific, detailed, internally consistent, and entirely free of the markers that trained forensic professionals associate with coached or influenced testimony. They represent the spontaneous account of a child who had been unable to communicate with any adult professional for 3 full days and who found, through no mechanism that any professional in this building designed or anticipated, a way to tell the truth. Patricia Solmes's pen was moving rapidly across her legal pad. This court therefore rules as follows, Judge Warren said. First, the substance of the child's disclosure provides sufficient probable cause to authorize an expanded investigation into the specific events of the night in question. Investigators are hereby granted authority to pursue lines of inquiry that were previously closed for lack of evidentiary foundation. The recording from the courthouse security system is to be preserved and made available to both parties and to investigators under proper chain of custody protocols. Daniel Park was writing so fast his pen was barely keeping up with his hand. Second, Judge Warren said, and here she paused for just a moment, a pause so brief that most people in the room might not have noticed it, but Patricia Solmes noticed it, and Richard Holt noticed it, and Dana Mercer noticed it. This court orders that the certified courthouse facility dog, Rex, be permitted to remain physically present beside the minor child during all future proceedings, testimony sessions, and formal interviews for the duration of this case. Rex is to be present, vested, and positioned at the child's side for as long as this case continues, and for as long as the child's caregivers and supervising psychologists determine his presence to be beneficial. The gallery stirred. A low murmur moved through the room like wind through grass. Richard Holt was on his feet before the murmur had finished. Your Honor, the defense objects strenuously to the presence of. Noted, Judge Warren said. Her voice had not changed in volume or temperature by a single degree. Objection overruled. Be seated, Mr. Holt. Richard Holt looked at her for one long moment. Then he sat down. The presence of a facility animal during child testimony is established practice in numerous American jurisdictions. Judge Warren continued, as if the interruption had not occurred. This court sees no compelling reason why Hamilton County should be an exception, particularly given the documented evidence of this specific child's capacity to communicate in the presence of this specific animal. She removed her glasses and looked out at the room, at the gallery full of people who had come to watch history, at the 2 legal teams with their folders and their pens, at Dana Mercer, sitting quietly along the wall with Rex stretched out beside her chair. Her eyes rested on Rex for one moment. This ruling, she said, is in the best interest of the child, which is and has always been the only standard that matters in this courtroom. She gathered her papers. We are adjourned until Monday morning, she said. Both teams will have until Friday to file any additional motions arising from today's ruling. She stood. And Mr. Holt, she added, almost as an afterthought, not looking up from her papers. Richard Holt looked up. Your Honor. Judge Warren picked up her notes and finally looked at him directly, steadily, with the full weight of 22 years behind her eyes. I watched the footage, she said simply. I would recommend you watch it too. Then she walked out. The room exhaled all at once, a collective release of breath that had been held through the entire proceeding. People in the gallery turned to each other. Patricia Soames set her pen down and pressed her fingers briefly to her eyes. Daniel Park leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. Richard Holt sat perfectly still, his hands flat on the table in front of him, looking at a point in the middle distance. And along the side wall, Rex stood up, stretched his front legs forward in a long, slow bow, shook himself once from nose to tail, and looked up at Dana Mercer with an expression that said, as clearly as any expression ever had, that he was ready for whatever came next. Dana looked down at him and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since 2 o'clock that morning. "Good boy," she said quietly. Rex wagged his tail once. Outside the courthouse windows, the October sky had finally broken open. A thin line of gold was pushing through the gray along the eastern edge of the city, pale and cautious and growing slowly stronger. It looked, Dana thought, almost exactly like hope. 3 days after Judge Warren's ruling, the Hamilton County Courthouse woke up to the kind of morning that feels like a fresh page. The October gray had finally broken. Sunlight came through the tall courthouse windows at a low, golden angle, laying warm rectangles across the marble lobby floor and climbing the walls in slow, bright panels that made the old building look, for once, less like a place where hard things happened and more like a place where hard things got resolved. The heating system had been fixed overnight. It had been groaning and stuttering for 2 weeks, and for the first time in days, the building held an even, comfortable warmth from the ground floor all the way to the third. Even the security guards seemed lighter that morning. One of them was humming something quiet and unidentifiable as he waved people through the metal detector. The clerk at the front desk had brought in a small arrangement of orange and yellow flowers and set them on the corner of her counter. Small things, barely noticeable, but the kind of small things that accumulate into a feeling, the feeling that today, despite everything, might be okay. At 8:23, a black county vehicle pulled up to the curb outside. The door opened and Corinne Briggs stepped out. She smoothed her jacket, took a breath, and reached back into the car. Lily came out holding Corinne's hand. She was wearing a different dress today, pale blue, with small white stars scattered across it like a piece of the night sky had been cut and sewn into something a child could wear. Her hair was in 2 pigtails again, but today they were even, both at the same height, done with care. Someone had tied small white ribbons around each one. She had bun tucked under her arm rather than clutched to her chest, a difference so small that a stranger would not have noticed it, but Corinne noticed it immediately and felt something warm move through her at the sight. Lily looked up at the courthouse steps. She looked at them for a moment the way you look at something you have decided not to be afraid of anymore, with a kind of steady, deliberate calm that costs something but holds. Then she took a breath and nodded once to herself and began to climb. Corinne climbed beside her, matching her pace, saying nothing. Some moments do not need words. This was one of them. Rex was waiting on the second floor. Not in the waiting room. Today there would be no waiting room, no gray chairs, no water dispenser gurgling in the corner. Today Lily would go directly to the formal hearing room on the 3rd floor, where the real work of the case would continue. But first, Rex. Officer Dana Mercer had brought him in early, at 7:30, and they had been waiting in the hallway outside the elevator for nearly an hour. Dana had a cup of coffee in one hand and Rex's leash in the other, and she had spent most of that hour thinking about the footage she had watched again last night. The 11 minutes in the waiting room, the way Lily had crossed the floor in those small, careful steps, the way she had pressed her forehead against Rex's and closed her eyes. She heard the elevator before she saw it. The familiar mechanical sound of cables and pulleys, the soft chime of arrival, the slow slide of doors opening. Lily stepped out of the elevator. She saw Rex before she saw anything else in the hallway, before the fluorescent lights, before the official notices on the closed doors, before the water fountain and the exit sign, and the two child welfare workers standing at a respectful distance down the corridor. Her eyes found him the way eyes find something they have been looking for even when they did not know they were looking. And she ran. Not the cautious, careful walk of Tuesday morning, not the small, deliberate steps of a child testing whether the floor would hold. She ran. Full, unself-conscious, 3-year-old running, arms already open before she had covered half the distance, Bun Bun bouncing under one arm with his chewed ear flying. She hit Rex like a small, warm wave and her arms went around his neck, and she buried her face in his golden fur and held on. Rex leaned into her. He did not startle. He did not pull back. He absorbed her completely, her weight, her warmth, her 3 days of waiting, and held steady beneath it the way he held steady beneath everything, like something built to last. Dana Mercer watched from 6 feet away and took a sip of her coffee so that she would have something to do with her face. After a long moment, Lily lifted her head. She looked at Rex with those enormous dark eyes, and she smoothed his ear with one small hand, a gesture so practiced and tender that it seemed like something she had been doing her whole life. Then she straightened up, adjusted Bun Bun under her arm and looked at Corinne. "Okay," she said, quietly, clearly, with a composure that made every adult in that hallway privately marvel. "Let's go." The hearing room on the 3rd floor was smaller than the main courtroom, designed for the more intimate proceedings that family court required. It had a round table instead of a rectangular one, chairs scaled to different sizes to accommodate children, softer lighting than the main courtroom, and walls painted a warm cream color rather than the institutional beige that dominated the rest of the building. Somebody had thought carefully about this room. Somebody had understood that the architecture of a space sends a message to the people inside it, and had tried to make that message as gentle as possible. Lily walked in and looked around. Dr. Sandra Holloway was already seated at the table, her notebook open, her pen ready, her expression warm and unhurried. 2 child welfare attorneys sat along the wall, present but deliberately peripheral, making themselves as unobtrusive as furniture. A video camera on a tripod stood in the corner, its red recording light already glowing. And in the center of the room, directly beside the child-sized chair that had been placed at the table for Lily, was a space. A deliberate, cleared, carefully measured space on the floor. Rex's space. Dana brought him in last after Lily was seated. He entered the room with his usual composure, his blue vest crisp, his amber eyes moving around the space with calm assessment. He found Lily immediately. He always found her immediately, Dana had noticed, as if he had some internal compass that oriented toward her, and walked to his designated spot beside her chair. He lay down. His warm body settled against the leg of Lily's chair, his side pressing lightly against her feet. Lily looked down at him. She reached down without hesitation and placed her hand on his back, and the gesture was so natural, so completely without self-consciousness, that it looked like something she had always done. Like breathing, like blinking, like the simple, automatic movement of a child reaching for the thing that makes her feel safe. She looked up at Dr. Holloway. "I'm ready," she said. Sandra Holloway smiled, a real smile, not the careful professional version she deployed in formal settings, but the genuine article. "Okay, Lily," she said softly, "whenever you want to start." And Lily started. She answered the first question clearly, without hesitation, her hand resting on Rex's back. She answered the second question the same way. When the third question, the most difficult one, the one that touched closest to the center of the scary night, arrived, she paused. Her fingers pressed a little deeper into Rex's fur. Her breathing shifted slightly, the way breathing shifts when a hard thing is being approached. Rex's side rose and fell beneath her hand, slow, steady, unhurried. Lily took a breath that matched his. And then she answered. Sandra Holloway wrote without looking up, her pen moving fast across the page. The video camera's red light glowed steadily in the corner. The two attorneys along the wall sat completely still, not wanting to disturb the air in the room. This continued for 47 minutes. 47 minutes of questions and answers, of careful navigation through difficult territory, of a 3-year-old girl moving through the landscape of the worst night of her life with a golden dog's warmth beneath her hand as her compass and her anchor. She did not perform. She did not recite. She simply told what she knew, in her own words, at her own pace, stopping when she needed to stop and continuing when she was ready to continue. Every time she paused, her fingers pressed deeper into Rex's fur. Every time, Rex's slow breathing steadied her back. There was one moment near the end, when the questions had moved into the most difficult territory, when Lily went quiet for nearly a full minute. She stared at the table in front of her, her jaw tight, her eyes bright. It was the longest silence of the session. Sandra Holloway waited, her pen still, giving the silence all the space it needed. Then Lily looked down at Rex. Rex looked up at her. His tail moved, once slow and steady. Lily looked back at Sandra Holloway and said, in a voice that was small but absolutely clear, "I remember what happened, and I'm going to tell you." And she did. When the session ended, Sandra Holloway closed her notebook and set her pen down with the deliberate care of someone handling something fragile. She looked at Lily, who had sat back in her chair and was now stroking Rex's ear with the peaceful, post-storm calm of someone who has made it through something hard and discovered that making it through was possible. "You did really well today," Sandra said. "Really, really well." Lily considered this for a moment. Then she looked down at Rex. "We did," she said simply, correcting the record, giving credit where it was due. Rex's tail moved in that slow, even way that had become, over the course of 3 extraordinary days, the most reassuring sound that several adults in this building had ever heard. Dana Mercer stood near the door and looked at the two of them, the small girl in the blue star dress and the golden dog lying warm and steady beneath her hand, and felt something complete itself in her chest. Not an ending, something more like the closing of a circle. The particular satisfaction of watching something that was supposed to happen finally happen, in exactly the way it was supposed to happen, at exactly the right time. Outside the courthouse windows, the October sun had climbed higher into the sky. It was, by any measure, a beautiful morning. The case concluded on a Thursday afternoon in late November. Outside the Hamilton County Courthouse, Cincinnati had fully surrendered to winter. The last of the October leaves were long gone, swept away by cold winds that came down from Lake Erie and moved through the city streets with the purposeful chill of something that intended to stay. The courthouse steps were dusted with the season's first thin frost, and the tall windows of the building's upper floors held the flat, pewter light of a sky that had forgotten what blue looked like. Inside, in the 3rd-floor hearing room with the warm cream walls and the child-sized chair, Judge Patricia Warren delivered her final rulings in the matter with the same measured precision she had brought to every moment of this case. She spoke clearly and without theater, because the outcome itself contained all the weight that was needed and required no additional drama from the person delivering it. Lily would be placed permanently in the care of her maternal aunt, a woman named Rose, who lived 40 minutes outside Cincinnati in a house with a yard and a vegetable garden, and a cat named Ferdinand, and enough quiet and stability to give a 3-year-old girl a genuine chance at a childhood that felt safe. The placement had been thoroughly investigated, carefully reviewed, and unanimously recommended by every professional involved in the case. When Corinne Briggs told Lily about Aunt Rose's house and the yard and the cat named Ferdinand, Lily had listened with great seriousness and then asked one question. "Does Ferdinand like dogs?" Corinne had laughed, a real, surprised, full laugh, the kind she hadn't expected to have in the middle of a courthouse on a Thursday afternoon. "I'll find out," she promised. It was, everyone agreed later, a very Lily kind of question. But the story did not end when the gavel came down. In the weeks and months and years that followed, something larger and quieter and more enduring began to unfold, not in courtrooms or legal journals or official policy documents, though it would eventually reach all of those places, but in the way people talked about what had happened on that October Tuesday on the second floor of a Hamilton County courthouse. The story traveled the way true stories travel, person to person, corridor to corridor, city to city, carried in the particular way that people carry things that have genuinely moved them. A bailiff told a cousin who worked in a courthouse in Lexington, Kentucky. A junior attorney mentioned it at a conference in Columbus. Dr. Sandra Holloway submitted her case notes and observations to a child psychology journal, where they were accepted, peer-reviewed, and published 4 months later under the title Spontaneous Disclosure in the Presence of Facility Animals, a case study in child witness communication. The paper was dense with clinical language and careful methodology, but underneath all of that, if you read it closely, you could still feel the 11 minutes in the waiting room. You could still feel Lily crossing the floor in her white shoes. The paper was cited 17 times in its first year of publication. Officer Dana Mercer's phone began ringing in December and did not really stop for the better part of 2 years. The calls came from courthouse administrators in Indiana, Pennsylvania, Michigan, West Virginia, and eventually from as far away as Arizona and Washington State. They came from judges and child welfare attorneys and forensic interviewers and county sheriffs, and people who ran victim advocacy programs, and people who ran juvenile detention facilities, and people who ran family resource centers in small towns where the nearest big courthouse was an hour's drive away. They all wanted to know the same thing. They all asked it in slightly different ways, but it always came down to the same question. How do we get a Rex? Dana answered every call. She was not a natural public speaker. She was a courthouse dog handler, methodical and private by nature, more comfortable in the quiet of a working day than in the spotlight of a story that had grown larger than she had ever anticipated. But she answered every call because she understood, with the clarity of someone who had been in that waiting room and watched what happened, that this information mattered, that getting it right mattered. That every courthouse that established a good facility dog program represented another child who might one day sit on a gray linoleum floor with a golden dog and find the words they could not find anywhere else. She became, almost accidentally, one of the leading voices in the national conversation about courthouse facility dog programs. She gave talks. She consulted. She helped 3 neighboring Ohio counties establish their own programs in the 18 months following Lily's case, personally assisting with the selection and certification process for 2 of the dogs. She was invited to speak at a national child advocacy conference in Washington, D.C. in the spring following the case, an invitation she accepted with some reluctance, and then delivered with the quiet, unadorned authority of someone telling the truth about something they had personally witnessed. She brought Rex with her to Washington. He was, predictably, the most popular attendee at the conference. Judge Patricia Warren gave one interview in the year following the case, a measured, carefully worded conversation with a legal publication called Family Court Review, in which she spoke about the implications of the case for child witness accommodation, the relationship between legal procedure and child psychology, and the question of how courts could better serve their youngest and most vulnerable participants. Near the end of the interview, the journalist asked her a question that was slightly outside the professional territory the conversation had stayed in until that point. "Is there a moment from this case," the journalist asked, "that you find yourself returning to, something that has stayed with you beyond the legal dimensions of it?" Judge Warren was quiet for a moment. She was not a person who answered quickly when a question deserved a considered response. "There is a piece of security footage," she said finally, 11 minutes long. A child walks across a room and sits down with a dog and begins to speak. She paused. "I have watched it more times than I will admit to publicly, and every time I watch it I think the same thing. "What's that?" the journalist asked. "That we build these elaborate systems," Judge Warren said. "These careful, sophisticated, well-intentioned systems for getting at the truth. Protocols and procedures and certified professionals and structured interviews and evidentiary standards." She paused again. "And sometimes the truth finds its own way through. Sometimes it comes through a channel we never designed and never would have thought to design. And our job, the job of the law, the job of the court, is to be humble enough to recognize it when it arrives." She looked out the window for a moment. "That dog was humble enough," she said. "He walked into a room and lay down on the floor and waited. He didn't bring a protocol. He didn't bring an agenda. He just showed up and made himself available." Another pause. "There are worse models for a lot of things." Rex worked the Hamilton County Courthouse for 4 more years after Lily's case. In that time, he sat beside 31 child witnesses, 19 adult witnesses in trauma-related cases, and an uncountable number of people who simply encountered him in hallways and waiting rooms and elevator lobbies, and needed, in that particular moment, exactly what he had to offer. He became part of the building's identity, as familiar and essential as the security desk in the lobby or the coffee cart that appeared every morning near the side entrance. People who worked in the courthouse began to measure their days by whether they had seen Rex yet. Seeing Rex, most of them agreed, made everything slightly more manageable. He retired in the spring, 4.5 years after the Tuesday morning that had made him briefly famous. Dana Mercer took him home to her house outside Cincinnati, where he claimed the sunniest spot on the back porch with the decisive authority of someone who has earned his rest and knows it. He slept long and deeply. He greeted visitors at the door with the gracious enthusiasm of a host who genuinely enjoys company. He accepted belly rubs with the dignified appreciation of a creature who has never once taken warmth for granted. He lived 4 more years in retirement, good years by every measure, quiet and full and unhurried the way the best endings always are. And Lily grew up in the house with the yard and the vegetable garden and the cat named Ferdinand, who, Corinne Briggs was happy to report after a follow-up visit, turned out to have no strong feelings about dogs one way or the other, which Lily declared to be perfectly acceptable. She was, by every account of the people who knew her in those years, a child who laughed easily and asked good questions, and had the particular quality of attentiveness in her eyes that belongs to people who have learned, young and hard, that the world deserves to be looked at carefully. She kept Bun Bun. He sat on her bookshelf in Aunt Rose's house, his left ear still chewed soft, his worn body holding the shape of every frightened moment he had been squeezed through. She did not carry him everywhere anymore, but she did not put him away either. Some things you keep not because you need them the way you once did, but because they remind you of the distance you have traveled. She remembered Rex. Of course she remembered Rex. You do not forget the thing that showed up for you on the worst day of your small life and asked nothing except to be beside you. You carry that forward. It becomes part of how you understand what safety feels like, what kindness looks like, what it means for another living thing to simply be present with you without agenda or demand. Years later, when Lily was old enough to understand the full shape of what had happened in that courthouse, old enough to read Dr. Holloway's paper and understand the legal debate and grasp the significance of what Judge Warren had ruled, she would say that the thing she remembered most clearly from that morning was not the words she had spoken or the things she had finally been able to tell. What she remembered most clearly was the feeling of Rex's forehead resting gently against hers, and the way that single moment had told her, more clearly than any word in any language ever could, that she was not alone, that she had never been alone, that something warm and steady and unconditional had shown up for her. And that had been, in the end, the only thing she had ever needed to find her way back. The end.